led a similar kind of discussion on a very closely related topic at Internet Governance Forum, which was Istanbul this year. And in that forum, we tried to cover not just takedown, but also blocking, because these are very closely related in that both of them have an intermediary who is stepping between two otherwise reachable parties and saying, you guys can't talk to each other. I'm hoping today that we're going to focus much more on takedown, where somebody is completely off the network, and kind of stay away from the network reputation systems such as Spamhaus or any of the other RBLs and whatnot, because I'm really focused on the impact of being completely off the network because some anti-abuse party has stepped between you and the network. So you'll see me constraining my remarks that way, and I'll hope that you do the same at the microphones. I think we have an hour, and we're really counting on an open discussion. So I have a few slides that I'm going to use to introduce the topic and give you some background on what I think the important issues and questions are. If I'm wrong, you'll tell us at the microphone that actually there's this whole other topic area that Vixie failed to address. That's fine. So think of these introductory remarks as just that. I'm trying to be a seed crystal for a larger discussion, because internet takedown is something that we need a public conversation about. We need, as an industry, as a community, to figure out when it should be possible, when it shouldn't be possible, and when it's done, how it should or should not be done. That is not a thing that you can leave up to vigilantes like me. I started the first anti-spam company, the MAPS company with the RBL. And I'm not sad that I did it, but I am sad that we couldn't have a public conversation about how to do it, so that maybe I wouldn't have been sued as often, and maybe there would be less spam today. So with that, let me launch into my prepared remarks. Takedown has to occur. Most of you know this, but in case you have been asleep any part of the last 20 years, what I will tell you is that there was a time when everyone on the internet was trusted. They all had contracts from the government that gave them the right to connect to what was, in some ways, a government network. And they did not abuse those connections, because if they had abused them, they could have lost not only their connection to the network, but they could have lost the contract that was enabled by that connection to the network. And so everything you may have heard about this having been designed as a survivable network designed to keep running after an atomic bomb and so forth is false. This network was built as a laboratory toy so that really smart people who had really strong ethics could communicate with each other. And the result of that is that there's a large population of bugs and glitches in the design of the internet itself. The architecture does not support multiple billions of unskilled and sometimes ethically questionable users. And the output of that is the internet crime wave that we're all part of, or not, I guess we're not part of creating it, but we're certainly being stirred by it and being directed by it. And we're here, among other things, because the internet is horrifically insecure, and most of the applications on it and operating systems and so forth are also just, they're not prepared for this level of violence. So when evolution occurs in a high trust environment and then you switch to a low trust environment, you get a undesired result, and that's where we are. And access to the internet and access to internet identifiers like domain names, IP addresses, and whatnot is now completely unconstrained. If you are alive, if you have a pulse, then you can connect to the internet and you can get domain names and you can get IP addresses, and you can use them in ways that were certainly not foreseen by any of the academic miracle workers who put this thing together back in the 1970s. So we have all the criminals and spammers and their whole supply chain who used to have to do their work manually now have automated capabilities, and they have pretty much a direct digital path to all of us and all of our families and all of our customers. So it gets worse. So the internet has a whois system. In other words, when you get an internet identifier like a domain name, like an IP address, you are supposed to provide accountability information. In other words, your real name and contact information by which somebody might send you an invitation to a lawsuit, or they might send the police in order to break down your door and put you in handcuffs and so forth. Criminals, of course, don't want those things to happen. Accountability is bad for them, and our system of accountability is incredibly weak. We have had a decades-long race to the bottom on how cheap we can make domain names and how easy we can make it to have those domain names without anybody being able to reach out and touch you back after you have annoyed them, spammed them, stolen from them, or whatever. And with that has come a shift from how can I solve this problem at the far end? Well, I probably can't make people behave better. So far end, all you can do at the far end is try and take somebody down, take them off the network, take away their IP access or their domain names, what have you. And that is a pretty difficult uphill struggle. There are now companies like Internet Identity, for example, who specialize in that kind of takedown because it is so hard for individual users and even large companies to learn the skill of how to take something down, no matter where in the world it might be connected to the internet or no matter who might have allocated the domain name. And, in a sense, that is the invisible hand of the market doing the right thing, creating capability to restore a better equilibrium. But that's a very narrow sense because it's not working. We are losing ground every year. So if you take a look at the simple math, if you had N people and M victims, and everybody had to do their own investigation of every bad thing that had happened to them, every victim wanted to do that, then the total number of investigations in the world would be the product of N and M. And you can see immediately that that is an incredibly large number. It's not going to happen. That is out of scale. Even if everybody had the skills necessary, it would be out of scale to have a separate investigation for every victim of every attack. So inevitably, third parties evolve. I mentioned there are companies that do this. There are also a lot of nonprofit volunteer organizations, Spam House, for example, who have learned to specialize in this, and they've learned how to make it a sustainable business activity for themselves so that they don't just volunteer their time and hope for the best and pay their mortgage some other way. And again, everything I've said so far is inevitable because of the internet's academic roots. Had it been built to be a global commerce system that it is today, it would not exist because that could not have been built other than organically, incrementally, step by step from then until now. So it was inevitable that the only thing that could become the internet would also have these problems and create these outcomes. Now the problem with these outcomes is that they are private. This is corporate police force type work. There are not a lot of laws, certainly there are no international laws governing what can and can't be done on the internet. And we don't even have the strength of treaties that would allow us to say, okay, so we have a treaty between these two countries where if you, on the other side of the ocean from me, start doing nuclear proliferation, then we're going to cut you off. We're not going to allow you access to our economy. And that's a certain way to put pressure on people. There is nothing like that for internet crime. If you are a small, poor, largely undeveloped or unproductive country, the internet looks like a really wonderful way to bring hard currency into your country from the rest of the world. And it turns out no one can act against you, even if it becomes broadly known that your country is a huge source of crime, you won't be cut off. There's no facility for going to the undersea cable that leads to a certain place and saying, all right, here's my axe, here's my chainsaw, because it's not okay with us that you act this way. We don't have that. I don't think we're ever going to have that, but I will keep asking. But anyway, these private police forces, these corporate counteraction teams, don't have any kind of international law or even common guidelines for what is the threshold of badness or the kind of badness or the threshold of evidence or what does it mean to have a commensurate response? You know, how do we have parity between the bad thing somebody did and the bad thing that then happened to them as a result of the bad thing they did? We got nothing. I'm hoping that in this room, as in the IGF earlier this year, and in rooms like this, we're going to start an international conversation about what is okay and not okay to do on the internet, and what is okay and not okay to do about the bad things that happen on the internet. Because at the moment, we're in the wild, wild west, and I don't like that. That's not, ultimately, that is going to frustrate investment and innovation. Right now, we have the inertia of the big bang of the internet, and everything is carried along by the fact that folks are still making a lot of money. But this does not lead to sustainability. So the dangers of intermediation, in other words, standing between somebody and the internet, are legion. For one thing, it's very difficult to know who else depends on the person you're about to cut off. One example might be that they are operating a name server, and if they were to lose connectivity because of your intermediation, then everybody else who has a domain name served by that name server would also be off the net. That may not be what you intend. In fact, that may be an unacceptable level of collateral damage. But the internet doesn't give you a good way to go enumerate the dependencies that a given network has inspired. I run a company called Farsight, and so we really do have a lot of observation capability. I know a fair amount, more than most people, about how the internet is wired and what depends on what, and I can't tell you that it is safe to unplug a certain network from the internet, where safe indicates that you don't want to hurt innocent third parties. So there are some well-observed risks there. Sometimes you take them anyway because you've tried everything else, but often they are done without any kind of forethought, which is a problem. The intermediary, that is to say the person who is doing the takedown, often has no direct communication path to the entity that they're taking off the net. Sometimes that's because there's a lawsuit going on and you don't want to talk to them because that'll just turn up in court records. Other times it's because you don't know who they actually are, you just know what IP addresses they were using. And so you don't necessarily have a good way to tell them in advance, look, you're doing the bad thing. If you keep doing the bad thing, then here's what's going to happen to you. Giving that notice, giving somebody an opportunity to correct the problems is often impossible. So you're often doing this type of disconnection without the ability to see if there was even an easier way that might have been less draconian. So we see mistakes, we see overblocking, we see all kinds of times when the person who was blocked ends up saying, hey, wait, it wasn't me. It was a total mistake. If you had just picked up the phone, we could have settled this. I hate that. This collateral damage thing is going to return over and over again in this discussion. So a few months ago, MAAWG was invited to give testimony at the Senate hearing on botnet takedown alongside the FBI and somebody else from the DOJ, Microsoft, Symantec, and I forget the other one. And MAAWG reached out to me and said, gee, Paul, you love the sound of your own voice. How would you like to go do this? And so we wrote a pretty, I think, strong position paper. And I went and read it in, and we participated in the Q&A. All of this is online. You can Google for it. It was fun. It was great. I'm not going to recapitulate the whole 4-page position paper. I will say simply that it's only 4 pages long. It would take about 10 minutes to read it, and I recommend doing that because a lot of very fine thought, and I don't mean by me, but a lot of very fine thought by the extended MAAWG team went into that document. But I do want to briefly go through the conclusion where we were trying to sew up the whole statement into a small number of points. Internet has been great. I can't imagine the world without it. On the other hand, the internet was built fast and sloppy, and every time somebody announces that there's a new light bulb that is got a wireless internet interface in it, I am immediately beginning to think about XML parser bugs and overruns and, gee, a botnet made of light bulbs. That's not going to be good for us. It's going to be fairly hard because they're not field upgradable and they don't necessarily have serial numbers, and this is a mess. But the faster we build it, the sloppier we're going to get. And so we're increasing the attack surface every day. So bad guys came with us. It would have been wonderful if real life was more like Star Trek, where the good guys got to get into starships and roam around the galaxy, and the bad guys had to stay home and continue to try and pick each other's pockets and so forth. That's not what happened. We moved all of human society into the digital era, and we brought all of our criminals with us, and we have gradually been improving the criminal breed with takedowns that don't involve jail time. So I'm kind of opposed to that approach. The Darwinian approach to improving the breed should not be used to help the bad guys. But anyway, there is a massive continuing illicit transfer of wealth from unproductive countries, or excuse me, productive countries to non-productive countries. And, you know, I say massive, I'm talking hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars a year, only some of which can be tracked by your credit card companies and your banks and whatnot. There's just a gigantic loss of the creativity and the productivity of people who like to work hard toward people who would rather steal their way to their next meal. And that's happening at the nation-state level. And the internet is what made that possible, right? When you have a border, then you can secure the border. The internet is borderless. So we have a democratic commitment in most of the developed world toward the democratic rule of law. And that keeps us all relatively safe. We can walk down the street to a coffee shop without having to arm ourselves, because there will be police there to make sure that anybody who tries to rob us or hurt us will face consequences, and thus that becomes a disincentive. And that works pretty well in meat space, but there isn't anything like that in the internet. On the internet, you can have your pocket picked by somebody who is 10,000 miles away from you and does not even speak your language. And again, that's something the internet has made possible. So those of you who helped build it should be feeling a little bit guilty right now. So right now, the best innovation that the bad guys have come up with, and I fear to think about what their future innovations will be, the best innovation is botnets. That's where instead of attacking you from their own internet connection, they attack other people in small ways, and they add those other people's assets to a digital empire, which can then be used to do all kinds of really cool things to you in a way that is not trackable to them. So you get a lot more power, you get amplification, you get leverage, you get more anonymity. It's, you know, botnets are the perfect tool. So right now, most of what we talk about taking down are botnets. But I want to emphasize it isn't just the botnets. There are plenty of criminal actors who are not using botnets, and they are fixed targets. They have domain names. They have, you know, fiber connections to the internet. They have peering. They have AS numbers. They've got address blocks. Sometimes takedown means going after them rather than going after some other construct like a botnet. And when you take these things down, you are helping the bad guys. You're teaching them. If you take away somebody's toys and leave them standing, leave them outside of jail, then what they're going to do is get mad, and then they're going to get even, and they're going to study the way that you took them down. And so I have been trying to get folks to understand that any counteraction you do that does not involve law enforcement is probably hurting your own cause in the long run. We need these people to face real consequences. Unfortunately, a lot of them are in countries where their police forces are either underfunded and incompetent or are part of the problem. So we have to stop reacting. We have to start looking at the underlying causes and we have to change our reactions so that they are a little bit more constructive toward our long-term aim of a better equilibrium between the productive and unproductive people of the world. So I raised a framework in IGF. It has, 6 points to it, and we named names there. We actually talked about some high-profile takedowns that had gone wrong, and I think that was a mistake. I'm not here to name names. I'm not going to point fingers at any of you who might have done something that I told you you shouldn't have done, or that a lot of people told you shouldn't have done. That gets us nowhere. Finger pointing is not why I'm here. So if you see some headlines hidden behind some of these bullet points, please keep it to yourself. So you want to take down what needs taking down, but not the extra. You have to avoid collateral damage, not just limit it. Because every time you hurt somebody who didn't have it coming, they and their friends will bear a grudge against you, and that will hurt your credibility more than any help you may have given it from the takedown. You should monitor your takedowns. Make sure that when you do something, you see that it really had the impact that you wanted, that it was effective and that it was not overbroad. Be ready to hit the undo button, because if you decide, gee, I didn't have enough evidence there, I didn't do enough research, I should back up and look at that again because I'm getting complaints from somebody I was not expecting to get complaints from, undo it. Because if it turns out you were right all along, you can put the take them off the net again tomorrow. You really want to avoid ex parte relief. Ex parte is one party. That's where you would go to a judge and say, look, I need a restraining order that will give the law enforcement people the power to seize assets or to disconnect something or whatever. And I can't let the person who's losing these assets, in other words, the person that this court order is against, I can't let them know it's coming, because if they knew this was going to happen, then I would suffer irreparable harm. That's the standard that you have to get an ex parte order. You have to be able to say that you will be harmed in a way that cannot be undone if the other party is allowed into this judge's chambers to argue the other side of the case. That's crazy talk, because the judge does not have the ability to evaluate your claim of irreparable harm. The internet is a pretty complicated thing, and there are tens of thousands of judges in this country alone, and I would bet that fewer than 24 of them have the ability to look you square in the eye and say, yeah, we're not going to do this ex parte thing because your claim of irreparable harm is crazy. And so what that means is if a judge is granting an ex parte order having to do with internet takedown, they're taking your word for it. But justice has scales. There's a scale of justice. It's an adversarial model. It requires somebody to argue each side, somebody to argue the innocence, somebody to argue the guilt, so that all of the evidence can be brought to bear in the judge's decision or the jury's decision, right? So that the adversarial model of justice is the best we have. It's all we have. And the ex parte system bypasses all of that. And I just want to say it should not be done, because the harm done to you will not be irreparable. So the technological capacity, make sure that when you issue some kind of a takedown instruction to an ISP or to your employees or through the civil procedures of lawsuits and restraining orders, that what you do is not controversial. Don't say that something is possible and that there won't be any collateral damage from it unless not only you, but the community has done some testing and has kicked the tires really hard and red-teamed your technology to make sure that it doesn't have a glaring failure mode where you're going to end up doing way more harm through a takedown effort than they were doing before you took them down. I'm going to say I know a little bit about DNS, and so in particular, if you're going to talk about DNS-related takedowns, such as proxying an Anycast service that goes around the world, I'd like to have some words with you before you go to the judge. If you're this is advice not so much for the person doing the takedown as having something taken down. If you put something on the network that is abusable, that a lot of other people, criminals and so forth, can then use your service to attack people, you should expect to get complaints. And if you can't keep up with those complaints, there are too many of them, and so you don't take care of business, you should expect to lose your connectivity, right? Because you can either pay up front for the actual cost of running your business, or you can externalize that cost and wait for the externalized cost to boomerang back to you in the form of not being connected anymore. Those are your choices. There is nothing on the menu that says that you can just operate at a net loss to everybody else in perpetuity. That won't happen. It hasn't happened. Nobody is big enough to get away with that. You need to measure the effectiveness of your takedown, and in a transparent way, I might add. Don't just take something down and forget about it forever. Take it down and measure the difference you made. Because it may be that you're doing a lot of work to take a lot of stuff down, but you cannot measure the difference. That means you're not moving the needle. That means you are adding a lot of controversy and complexity to a system that doesn't tolerate complexity well, to no purpose. And finally, see that you have jurisdiction. Don't use a court order over here to affect people over there. Do what you can to clean up the messes in your own backyard, but in jurisdictions outside of yours that might depend on assets in your jurisdiction, it is far better to seek voluntary cooperation than to just unilaterally impose terms on them. I'm sure you've all followed U.S. history, at least in the last 100 years, where unilateralism ends in a disadvantage to the larger party who imposed their will. So this was contributed to me by Catherine and David, who are sitting here in the front row. And this was a framework that they proposed. Dave or Catherine, do you want to stand at the microphone and work through this?
So this slide is a summary slide from a talk that Catherine Carpenter and I did at SciCon in Estonia earlier this year. And it's the sort of culmination of a number of papers that have been done. I did a paper at LEET on takeover of botnets in 2012, and another paper on remote mitigation of botnets at Wexer in 2010. So this framework that we are talking about encompasses some of the important aspects of trying to do takedowns in a way that addresses some of the problems that have happened in previous takedowns. The first bullet, deconfliction in the military, this is trying to avoid friendly fire. And there have been many instances where law enforcement has been investigating systems and they found that other parties have been in those systems besides the criminals. And there have been papers published where researchers are doing things to poison a botnet and detect that other researchers are doing the same thing. There have been some discussions, I've been part of some in private before actions have taken place to try to understand what are the potential problems in a botnet takedown. And I've done a number of these papers I was just mentioning on reviewing botnet takedowns after the fact. The lessons that are learned need to be learned by everyone, and the conversations that occur in private, only the people who are part of those conversations learn from them. As Paul was saying, there are some issues with the private sector trying to do things extrajudicially. So we prefer that government action over private sector action be favored, especially at the extreme end of what I call the active response continuum. So going out and manipulating systems that you don't control. These actions should favor civil or criminal process over the private sector doing things in an extrajudicial way. And we want people to try and follow Stephen Carter's definition of integrity, which is knowing what is right and wrong, making your decision based on that knowledge, even at cost to yourself, and being able to clearly articulate how you came to those decisions. Just saying, I'm an ethical person, what I'm doing is ethical, is not sufficient. We want people to be able to justify that based on clear principles and to be able to have discussions about it in that manner.
So, some things that I knew of that we should be talking about. include has this problem been solved in meat space, away from the digital world, maybe in the pre-internet days? Is there some regime that was pioneered by some ancient culture that bears some similarity to this? Grazing the commons has sometimes been raised as an illustrative example. But is there something we should be looking to? Has humanity already solved this problem in some other context? Are there other frameworks? I've mentioned the one that we came up with, that was SSAC, the ICANN Security and Stability Committee, that both Jonathan and Benedict were part of preparing those remarks. So we had a framework there, and you just heard Dave Dietrich talk about his framework. Are there other frameworks that have been put into place around this problem around the world? And then, of course, any other idea that comes up. This is meant to be a public conversation, and I can only do so much as a seed crystal. I'm really counting on you guys to now empty your pockets of all ideas, good and bad.